All right, so we spoke about lymph nodes. That was the last thing we spoke about in part one of lymph. So from in lecture two or this part of lymph, we're going to continue to talk about lymph nodes and then go forward with this whole chapter. So what are lymph nodes? Lymph nodes are principal secondary lymphoid organs of body, right? So we discussed about the primary lymphoid organs, which is T cell, where red bone marrow and thymus, right? But the secondary lymphoid organ are the lymph nodes, spleen, malt, and all of these are the secondary lymphoid organ. Among these, the main secondary organ is the lymph node, are the lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are present all over our body, throughout our body, either deeply embedded within the connective tissue, and they can be classified by their zones of the body, like cervical, axillary, inguinal. Two functions. Firstly, lymph node actually house macrophages that remove and destroy microorganisms and debris that enter the lymph, right? Secondly, is the immune system activation, offer a place for lymphocytes to become activated. Like lymphocytes are exposed because lymph nodes are actually also houses pathogens. Whenever a lymphocyte encounters with a pathogen, that is when lymphocyte is activated, and that actually heavily happens in lymph node when the lymphocyte actually gets activated, because they are the first time they are exposed to a pathogen. That's what means immune system activation. Lymphocytes becomes activated because they're first time attacking the or encountering the pathogen, so now they know what to do, so that's their activation, and that happens in lymph node. So lymph node has two histologically distinct part, cortex and medulla, and outside covered by capsule. So it looks like this. This is capsule. The capsule invaginates or folds inside and forms structures called trabeculae. The outer part is cortex, right? And the inside part is called as the medulla. So the superficial cortex actually houses T and B cells inside. Which and this T cell, the deeper cortex actually has more T cells. The outer cortex more have B cells, more or less heavily dividing B cells. They also have abundant number of dendritic cells, like associated immune cells. Okay. Inside the medulla, which is much more deeper inside, for example, over here, that's medulla. So what they will house here, or what will happen here, it also has T cells, B cells, and plasma cells. So this is heavily rich with lymphocytes, where they can encounter pathogens. Now, how lymph really enters lymph nodes and what really happens there? They enter through the afferent lymphatic vessels and exit through the efferent vessels. So here they enter through the afferent vessels on the convex side. So this is the convex side, and they exit through the concave side. They exit through the concave side. Okay. Now, like you can see, fine, and this is also called as the hilum part of the by the efferent lymphatic vessel. And lymph actually, that's how it travels. Now, one thing you will see that there is presence of more afferent vessels than efferent vessels. So the exit is less than the entry of lymph, and than the entry point of the lymph in the nodes. So there are more afferent, which is the entry point, that is more compared to the efferent vessels, which is less. So what happens, because there are more entry points compared to exit points, the lymph actually stagnates within the lymph node itself. And this is the time when the lymph, because the lymph has lymphocyte in it or macrophages in it, so this is the time when they actually get the time to function, for example, get exposed to pathogens, or macrophages also get exposed to pathogens, like that. So that's, it is important to have more entry points therefore compared to exit points. Some clinical issues that can happen in lymph nodes: bulbose, which means inflated, swollen, tender lymph nodes, that results when lymph nodes are overwhelmed by what they're trying to destroy, means basically the pathogens. They can get swollen, Pus filled. This is a typical clinical condition during bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is happens by by a bacteria. Lymph node also can become secondary cancer sites if metastasizing cancer cells become trapped in the node. But this is pretty dangerous because if they are inside the lymph node, then they become pretty easily can circulate in the body. But the only difference between a normal, like a bacteria infected or microorganism or pathogen infected lymph node and a cancer infected lymph node is cancer infected lymph node do not give pain compared to microorganism infected lymph nodes. So question for you, bulbos are, what are bulbos? Bulbos are inflamed as swollen. We just now spoke about it, the lymph nodes. Now, lymph tend to stall inside lymph node due to why? Because the entry point is more than the compared to the exit point, which means there are fewer efferent uh, vessels compared to the afferent. We just spoke about this. The afferent, the entry point is more in the convex side compared to the exit efferent vessel in the concave side, in the hilum. Okay. Now we'll talk about, we have already spoke about lymph nodes. We'll talk about spleen, malt, and thymus. So spleen is a blood-rich organ located, size of the first located on the left-hand side of the abdominal cavity, just below the stomach. This is the largest lymphoid organ. This is served by a splenic artery, which enters and exits at the hilum. This is also a site of lymphocyte proliferation, immune surveillance, and response. This cleanses blood of aged blood cells, platelets, macrophages, and also can remove debris. So, other than that, it also can break down RBCs. Okay, store blood platelets, monocytes. It also may be a site of fetal erythrocyte production. Okay, means RBC production. So if you see a spleen, it has a fibrous capsule outside, but this is spleen, but it also has some white pulp and red pulp, and that is very much required for whatever. It's basically dependent on what kind of function it does. Means, so if you see a section of spleen, you will see the white pulp where immune function happens. Means most reticular lymphocytes are here in the white pulp area. Okay, so there are clusters found in the central arteries and they're kind of, they look white also in color. In red blood cells, so therefore, whatever these lymphocyte proliferation, immune system surveillance, or whatever the lymphocyte function is, that happens in the white pulp area. But when it comes to blood cells, the RBCs, these RBCs are present in the red pulp area. Okay, like over here, the red pulp area, rich in RBCs and macrophages. They're composed of also splenic cords and separate blood-filled splenic sinusoids or venous sinusoids. So more or less, the white pulp has the more of the lymphocytes. The red pulp has more of the RBCs. So all the RBC function happens in the red pulp. Spleen has a thick capsule, right? So direct blood, direct blow or severe infection may cause it to rupture. So if there is too much pressure on it, spleen sometimes can rupture. So too much of blood flow or severe infection can actually rupture spleen. So if that happens, then it requires to have the splenectomy, which means surgical complete removal of the spleen. Okay. But sometimes it is partially damaged. Then spleen also can repair itself. Okay. But if spleen must be removed, then the bone marrow and liver actually takes over, right? Because it also houses RBCs. So that function is pretty critically important. So therefore, if spleen is removed, then these organs will take over. But it is seen that if spleen is removed in a child less than 12 years old, and if a small part of spleen is there, then spleen can regenerate also. Next comes the moles. What is malt? It is mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. Okay, malt. This is the simply means the lymphoid tissues in mucous membranes throughout the body. They protect from pathogens that are trying to enter the body, and typically malt is found in tonsils, Peyer's patches, and appendix. So let's talk about that first. So tonsil. Tonsil is the simplest lymphoid organ. It's located around our pharynx. Three types. One is palatine tonsil, which is located at the posterior end of the oral cavity. There is, palatine posterior end of the oral cavity, so behind your tongue. The pharyngeal is also called, which is actually at the nasal cavity, which is also called as the nasopharynx, or located in the posterior walls of the nasopharynx. And then comes the lingual tonsil, which is the lump at the base of the tongue. Okay, so three types, mainly palatine, lingual, and then pharyngeal. And then also there are some tubal tonsils, which are surround opening on the around the auditory tube. What do they do? They function. Their function is to gather and remove pathogen in food or in air. So which means the air that we are breathing or the food they're eating, if it has some form of um, pathogen, some kind of bacteria, tonsil can remove it. Why? Because it has this malt, presence of malt in it. Okay. So malt is the mucus associated lymphoid tissue, right? So therefore, it has some immune function. Because of presence of this malt, what they do, they will actually trap the pathogens, and there are some lymphocytes present in there. So therefore it will try to develop some memory or against that pathogen, or will try to fight the pathogen. Okay, but this is not, obviously tonsils are not fully encapsulated. Pierce patches, what is this? This is clusters of lymphoid follicles at the distal portion of the around this area of the small intestine. These are also called as aggregated lymphoid nodules. Their structure is very similar to tonsil. What do? They destroy bacteria, prevent them to enter into the intestinal wall, and also they generate memory lymphocytes. Again, malt is present here, so these lymphocytes are present there, so they will generate memories, these lymphocytes, when they are exposed to bacteria or pathogens, and that's how they can prevent infection anymore further. All right, we will talk about memory of lymphocytes in next chapter in immune system. Third is appendix. What is appendix? The offshoot of the first part of the large intestine. We see this tiny organ contains large number of lymphoid follicles. Location aids in functions, which means also they also generate memory lymphocyte. They also have the mucosa or the malt present in them. Okay. Therefore, they also generate memory lymphocyte, and they mainly also destroy bacteria or prevent microorganisms to reach into the intestinal wall. Then comes thymus. Thymus is in your inferior part of your leg, of your neck, sorry. It is partially overlies the heart, because this is where your heart is in between the lungs, but thymus is in the inferior part. It's a lymphoid organ where T cells mature. We spoke about this before, where T cells mature. Okay, T cells originate in bone marrow, but they mature in T cells. And this is mostly active and largest during childhood. And after that, it slightly starts decaying, atrophies. But it still produces some immunocompetency, which means maturity of T cell, helps in T cells to mature. Well, this lacks B cell, but only has strictly, it is dedicated for T lymphocyte maturation. Okay, that's how it looks like. We'll not get into too much of structure of thymus. So this is the overall summary of what the lymphoid organs and tissues do. For example, lymph nodes, they cleanse the lymph, site for lymphocyte activation and proliferation. Spleen cleanses blood, site for lymphocyte activation again. And then comes malt. Also, malt helps in lymphocyte activation. It's present in various other organs, for example, appendix, tonsils, and Peyer's patches. And then thymus, but thymus is not all lymphocyte. It is the site for T cell maturation. Lastly, about developmental aspect of lymphatic system, lymph nodes are seen in a fetus around week 5 of fertilization or embryonic development. Firstly, it develops as a lymph sac. There's a jugular lymph sac that actually divides to form the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct, the main two ducts of lymph. And now lymph organs, except thymus, everything arises from mesoderm. The only thing, the thymus itself actually origins from the endoderm. So endoderm and mesoderm are the two layers of the fetus. Ectoderm is the outside layer, endoderm is the inside, and mesoderm is inside. Okay, so mostly lymphoid organs arise from mesoderm. The thymus itself, though, arises from the endoderm as an outgrowth of pharynx. So last two concept checks, the thymus, what is it important for? We discussed this. Thymus is obviously T for thymus. So it is a site where the T lymphocytes mature. Tonsils promote memory of pathogens by, and I told you this while just a little bit before, they trap the pathogens to develop immune cells with memory, and they trap these pathogens like whatever food you are eating or whatever air you are inhaling. They have because tonsil is present in the nasal, like in the pharynx and nasal cavity area, right? So whatever food you are eating, that if that has, or the air you're breathing, it has some kind of bacteria, then tonsil actually can help trap the pathogen, because it is also a site where lymphocytes are present, right? Scattered lymphocytes are there. So these lymphocytes can like detect that pathogen and can develop memory, because it's a majority, I mean, a huge function of lymphocytes is to develop immunological memory, which we'll talk about next chapter. But in tonsils, the same thing happens because lymphocytes are present there. All right, so that's what concludes our lymph system, lymphatic system. Please continue to work on the concept check and submit that by the deadline. The case studies for exam 2 is also now open. Watch out my announcement for that. All right, thank you.